Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I want to dive into a very important controversy in the world of cluster B and narcissism. Basically, in the community of influencers who talk about, let's say, NPD, narcissism, cluster B, borderline, there's a major theme, and a lot of people really believe this. Okay, this idea, this notion, this concept that that cluster B disorders, that narcissism, that borderline, that antisocial, these are reactions to trauma. Okay, so basically, what I think people are saying is that trauma causes these conditions. Okay, um, and I will be the first to say, okay, that I know that trauma is associated. I know trauma is associated with these conditions, okay? And so I think there's no doubt that trauma is correlated. And in fact, I would say trauma is highly correlated with cluster B, narcissism, borderline, um, antisocial. Okay, it's highly correlated, but I consider myself to be a trauma skeptic in that I'm not saying that trauma has nothing to do with it. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm just skeptical as to whether it's a good policy to believe that trauma is the sole cause of these conditions. Okay. And I also wonder if it's a good policy for us to rest too much in the confidence, that these conditions are the result of trauma. Okay. I think more than likely, trauma is part of the picture. In other words, trauma is going to be correlated. Okay. But I think we need to be very careful, maybe just careful, not to assume that these disorders are just resulting only from trauma, or that it's just trauma causes these conditions. Because I think what's going to happen if we fall into that policy of thought where we so easily just assume the cause is so simple and this is just the result of trauma, okay, we may then underestimate, okay, how much there are other factors causing these conditions, okay, deeper temperamental factors, okay, where if we don't have, like, say, enough appreciation of those temperamental factors, all right, we may be avoiding something in our recovery where we're not going to be fully addressing and giving the respect it deserves, okay, to the parts of us that are at a deeper kind of temperamental level, sort of aside from the so-called trauma, or even whatever, a so-called trauma. Trauma is very real. Trauma does happen, but we may need to look at other aspects of our experience, okay, including our own temperament, okay, beyond the trauma, that may really explain a lot of why we fall into these conditions, right? And also, I'd like to explain how there may be a reason why trauma is associated with these conditions. And that very reason may explain why these conditions are not caused by the trauma. Okay, so if we're really open-minded, okay, let's just get right out of the bag. Let's just assume that let's just agree. Let's agree. I'm sorry. Let's agree that there are some basic temperamental characteristics that really do go hand in hand with cluster B. Okay, I think almost anybody would agree that a cluster B person has a limited ability, for whatever reason, neurologically. We have a limited ability to hold different points of view of thought. We have a limited ability to hold different perspectives simultaneously, okay, and to hold different ways of thinking and different possibilities simultaneously, especially when certain of those points of view, certain of those considerations are charged, have a lot of emotional charge to them. Okay. Classic example. All right. If you're not sexually attracted to a woman, okay, when you talk to that person, you're just going to see a person. And you're going to focus on their political orientation, their personality, whether you think they're reasonable, whether you think you can trust them, whether you think that they're a good person, whether you think, whatever. You're going to think about all the different issues, but you're not going to be thinking about how attractive they are because you're dealing with that person, right? But if you throw into the mix that that person is very attractive, okay, that's going to kind of tend to flood out the other considerations, and maybe you're not going to worry so much about if you think they're a really trustworthy person, unless they demonstrate they're extremely untrustworthy. But just in the average mix, you're going to kind of tend to de-emphasize, and it's going to kind of fade out from your consciousness how important you think their philosophies are, or whether you think that they're trustworthy, whether you think whatever. You're just going to be focusing on how attractive they are, depending on how attractive they are, and depending on how much noise your brain makes in response to how attractive they are, right? So in other words, it depends on how you react to how attractive they are, right? That's just one example. Another example could be, let's say if I don't have any baggage with a person, like if I don't have any baggage with a person, right? Then and if there's nothing special about that person and I'm just dealing with that person, okay, I'm going to be focused on let's say the terms of the deal with that person, like whatever we're negotiating, whatever we're talking about. Okay, but if I have baggage with that person, okay, let's say that person belongs, let's say, to a political affiliation. Let's say I have a thing against Republicans, or let's say I have a thing against fundamentalist Christians, right? And if I know that person is a hardcore fundamentalist Christian, I'm going to be so flooded with that idea. That's going to be so big for me. It's going to be occupying so much noise in my brain. It's going to diminish my ability to just sort of deal with that person objectively, right? So basically, that shows up for us with cluster B, where if there are certain aspects of a situation, okay, whether we're dealing with a person or just a situation where there's something about that situation that's really frustrating us, okay? Like say another example, like say if I'm driving in traffic and I'm running into red light after red light after red light and there's a lot of traffic, okay? It's not a personality issue. It's just there's something that's pissing me off, okay? And it's pissing me off so much that now I'm diminishing my awareness and my perspective on the other issues that are present at that time, okay? Like say driving safely. Let's say, reminding myself that it's not the end of the world if I'm a little bit late, just other possibilities. I'm more flooded with that one issue that I'm frustrated, that I'm running into red lights and I'm running whatever. So bottom line, whether it's attractiveness or maybe somebody just pisses you off, and you decide you can't stand that person, right? But you're so flooded by that, whatever, that you lose your ability to hold all these multiple other considerations so you can have a more balanced perspective. And in a sense, just be more rational and more, just more objective in the way you deal with people and things, right? So it could be attractiveness, it could be just stimulation, something that makes you upset, something that makes you angry, or even something that makes you very happy. Like, oh, that I like that person so much, he's so cool, and someone is so cool to you that floods your mind and you lose your perspective just to treat that person in a more neutral way, just because you never know. Maybe that he just seems that way, or maybe if you're so flooded with thinking that somebody is so cool, it's going to kind of unbalance your overall perspective and just having a more impartial interaction with that person. Okay, so if we can start by admitting that people with cluster B, that we tend to have like an overflooding, we tend to get overflooded by stimulation, and we also have trouble holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, right? Okay, if that is sort of like the one of the basic characteristics of our temperament, right? And if we come from a family where in our family people tend to have the same limitation neurologically, right? That's exactly the kind of limitation, okay, that over time is going to produce a lot of turbulence in the family, okay, and possibly abuse or mistreatment or just excessive, like say, people getting excessively angry or acting out, right? So in other words, if we already have just that simple combination, okay, where we tend to get over flooded by stimulation and where we have difficulty holding multiple considerations simultaneously, okay, that's exactly the set of temperamental characteristics that will produce over time in a family more fights, more incidents, more episodes, more situations where parents say things just out of anger that they didn't really mean to say, okay, where they could be hurtful, right? And situations where they might start to, like, say, judge their children and sort of see their children in an unfair light, which is a form of abuse, right? So now we have a chicken and the egg problem. Okay, where if we accept that there are some basic temperamental characteristics that define cluster B, okay, that are almost always present with cluster B, those are exactly the characteristics that will tend to produce really dramatic incidents that will be traumatic. So now we have a problem. Which comes first? Okay, and it's a big problem. Okay, so I think, nobody can fully answer exactly what comes first. Okay, I think it's more likely that they both kind of come together, right? But at the very least, we should at least understand, okay, that it's tempting to say that everything about me, every problem that I have, my cluster B problems, my personality issues, is because I was traumatized. Okay, what's probably more fair to say is it's hard to say exactly what caused me to have what I have. But in my family, we tend to have these temperamental characteristics, okay? And that these temperamental characteristics are probably likely, they probably lend themselves to have more traumatic situations, okay? So in the end, I think it's better for us not to get too invested in one simple causal account, one simple explanation of why people have cluster B problems. Okay, there's no need to get that invested in it. All right, because it may be that we just have temperamental characteristics, okay, that are inherited and that may be just rampant in our families or even in our neighborhoods. Okay, and that those temperamental characteristics are probably likely to result in a lot of really dramatic incidents and a lot of, like, say, you know, a lot of harming, a lot of harming of other people and basically trauma. So I think it's, I'm not saying that trauma doesn't have something to do with it. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying why do we want to so easily get too invested in trauma as the sole or dominant cause when we can be open-minded and consider this probably a combination. Okay, it could be a little bit the trauma, because the trauma could feed into these characteristics. All right, so I'm open to the fact that if I'm exposed to a lot of trauma, okay, and if I have these characteristics, a lot of overstimulation in that, like, say, traumatic stimulation, if I'm already prone to make a lot of noise in my brain and to overflood, okay, it may be that trauma makes that worse in my developmental stage, okay? But I also have to own the fact that I probably do have to some degree, I probably already came out of the egg. I was probably already born with maybe a tendency to make a lot of noise in my brain and to have difficulty holding different perspectives simultaneously, okay? And also maybe combined with maybe an excessive sensitivity, easily triggered, explosiveness, whatever. So it may be that I already came, like, say, with the temperament that was likely to produce a kind of a cluster B personality, okay? But the trauma it was sort of like the gasoline on the fire, you know what I mean? It made it worse, possible. But I still think it's helpful not to forget that we have temperamental characteristics, all right? And that the temperamental characteristics themselves are probably likely to produce trauma, right? So the trauma could be a result of these temperamental characteristics. In the end, that's the issue that we have to work with, is carrying these temperamental characteristics, okay? So all I'm saying, when I say trauma skeptic, okay, I'm not saying no trauma, there's no trauma, and that trauma has nothing to do with, okay? No. I'm just saying broaden out the open-mindedness, okay? So that we can also be mindful and just be respectful of the fact that there may be a lot of basic temperamental aspects of ourselves that were probably likely to result in trauma, okay? And that also may have a big part to play in why we are cluster B, okay? And even to be open-minded and to suggest that even if we don't have a lot of trauma, maybe not much, if we have these characteristics, we may end up in the cluster B spectrum anyway, you know what I mean? And so we'll never know the full answer. Like, by being a skeptic, that doesn't mean that I have the answer. I'm just skeptical of putting too much, getting over invested in just the trauma as a simple, maybe dominant account of why we're this way. I think in reality, more likely, I think trauma is probably not so dominant an account, not so dominant of a cause of why we're like this. It may be part of it, but I think maybe we ought to give more respect for the possibility that maybe it's temperament, and maybe it's a temperament that we may share with our family, that may show up in different ways in our family, that in some people may result in addictions, in other people may result in ADD, in other people may result in explosive, people that are otherwise healthy, but they're kind of explosive, or people that are just narrow-minded and kind of black and white, but not necessarily full-blown borderline, right? But that as long as you come from a family and a culture that has these kind of processing limitations and these getting over flooded, let's say, by stimulation, right? If we come from that environment, not all of us are going to be exactly cluster B, but we may come from an environment where generally the environment is likely to produce trauma, and it's likely to produce addictions, behavior issues, bad temper, anger management. And so that in the same family, not everybody has to be a cluster B, but these basic temperamental issues could produce a cluster B person, right? And so that let's say if I come from a family where I'm pretty sure I'm the only cluster B person, it may still be true that we all have these temperamental issues, okay, and they just express themselves in different ways, but that these temperamental issues could account for the abuse, right? But they could also explain why some of us fall into the cluster B condition, So, and then the other thing too is, not to fall into, not to be naive and to think that cluster B is simply that I have limited processing and that I have trouble holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. It's a little more than that. To get to cluster B, you have to buy into certain software, okay? Given the hardware, given the operating system that I just described, these neurological limitations, you do have to additionally buy into some software. You have to download some software, okay, to get into the specific grandiosity and the specific pattern of, thinking you're above people and not thinking much of other people, or thinking of people in a diminished manner. So there is some additional software you have to get to go full-blown cluster B. But I think we should respect that underlying all this stuff, there may be some common sort of temperamental characteristics that may have a lot to do with why we end up going all the way into cluster B. And so that as we work on trying to get better, part of it is, let's go back and figure out the traumas. Okay, but not to pretend that really explains everything. Okay, it may not explain everything. It may just be something we have to reconcile with, and it may be part of it, but I think we may be foolish to invest too much into the idea that explains everything. Okay, that there may be some temperamental stuff that we have to own, and also that may help us identify with people who are not necessarily cluster B, but who have similar temperamental issues. Okay, so I think it would be very healthy for people who have narcissism to understand that, apart from some software differences, we may have some fundamental commonalities with people who have addictions, or people who have antisocial, or people who have ADD, okay, because of processing limitations. So it may help us in some ways to understand that while we may have taken a different turn in some of the software, basically down deep in the area of the hardware, we actually have a lot in common with other types of, personality disorders or behavior issues, or even people who are subclinical but have certain issues. We can find that commonality. Okay, and maybe that would help us maybe improve where we could maybe borrow modalities of therapy that maybe are good for borderline, and trust that they may help people with narcissism if we can just find a way to make it meaningful. And so I guess if I were to look at, like, say, what I think is the most promising for, let's say, getting better from NPD, from narcissism, I would say, first of all, moderate expectations. Okay, the idea is not to become a perfect person who has all this feeling towards other people. Get rid of all that. The idea is maybe to set the expectation very modest, to at least try to get better than where you're at. Okay, and from where you're at to try to get better, but not necessarily in the vision of, let's say, being a more emotional person, or being a more warm and fuzzy, empathetic person in the in the maybe in the way that we think of empathy. Like, how would you say? Like, I think we kind of stereotype empathy. I think the real empathy that matters, okay, is not that you feel and have sentimentality towards others. I think the real empathy is that you care and you have understanding. Okay, you don't have to be a sentimental person to care and to have understanding. So, I think we need to have much more maybe kind of modest expectations. Not to think of ourselves as becoming like this gushing, sentimental, wonderful person, but just to be better than what we're at, but to define our improvement, maybe not so much in terms of directly, let's say, being less arrogant or directly being less snobby or thinking less of people, but maybe to think more in terms of, let's say, being able to hold different considerations simultaneously to improve our holding capacity, right? And then to trust that if we can do that, we'll actually be a better person. Okay. But to get there, we have to start with a more mechanical, neurological exercise of maybe trying to hold more dissonant considerations simultaneously. And at the same time, to work on recognizing when we get flooded by stimulation. When we get angry at someone, when we're attracted by someone, when maybe we think someone is wonderful and we're like wowed, we're like spellbound, and to recognize that when we're spellbound or irritated or stimulated or attracted, that we tend to get flooded, right? And to work on recognizing that flooding and to sort of work on either recovering, from the flooding, or maybe learning to develop simultaneous awareness while we're flooded. Or the other thing is maybe to learn how to go through periods of avoiding the flood so that we can maybe get a new baseline where we learn to know ourselves as a non-flooded person, right? But that may take a kind of a withdrawal. We have to get away from those stimulations and maybe reconstruct a baseline where we get to know ourselves as a person who's not overly stimulated, right? So these are different techniques we can use to kind of like try to make the most of our temperament, not pretending we're really going to change our temperament, but learning better strategies to deal with our temperament so that maybe we can change our baseline a little bit and maybe create a different sense of what is my home baseline. Like, maybe I'm used to being stimulated all the time, being busy all the time, but maybe I could recalibrate and get to know myself as maybe a more boring person who does not have a lot of fireworks, a lot of stimulation. And with that new baseline, that may be useful for me, maybe to develop as much as I can to maybe develop more perspective in the world, And then if we're able to do these basic things, these strategies, we may end up indirectly becoming a better person and being a little less pathological, a little less, let's say, narcissistic or borderline, whatever. But in order to get there, we may have to focus on the more boring kind of just temperamental issues, right? But I think the only way we're going to get there is if we don't get too invested in this idea that the reason I'm this way is because of this trauma. And this idea that if I just go into this trauma and just understand it, suddenly I'm kind of on the path. Like, we may be overlooking some very, very basic mechanical kind of the physics of why we're this way, which may be very neurological. And we may be avoiding, maybe putting more effort into sort of exercising and getting more mental fitness in this area of, like, say, holding multiple considerations simultaneously and dealing with the problem of being flooded by stimulation, right? Because those are real issues, And I know all of us in our own way, we're all working on all these things, but I just think that, maybe intangibly, kind of in an intangible thing, qualitatively, we may just tend today, I think we may be tending to be investing too much explanatory, we're invested too much in the explanation of the trauma. And we may need to kind of put a little more skepticism on how much we're invested in that, and maybe explore a little more the neurological temperamental issues and work on those too. And we may find that if we have reasonable expectations, if we're not, like, say, spellbound by the popular notions of what makes a good person, that we have to be very sentimental, we have to be very emotional. If we maybe we can have a more modest, expectation of what it means to be a better person, and maybe learn to have, like, say, caring and understanding without necessarily having sentimentality, right? And if at the same time we can learn to maybe exercise ourselves to have more simultaneous awareness of different considerations, and also to work on being aware of our flooding, how we get flooded by stimulation. Okay, and if we can just kind of work on those things, we may, if we have reasonable expectations, not too ambitious, and if we're willing to go in slow steps, we may find that actually that mindset where we don't develop like a trauma complex, or a trauma ideology, right? Where we can just be a little more open-minded that it's a more complicated story, okay? And maybe get more curious about the neurological aspect, that may help us maybe have a little more multidimensional, maybe a more multidimensional, sort of recovery, so that our recovery might be a little more realistic and a little more slow steps, and where we might actually indirectly, we might actually really improve without directly trying not to be narcissistic, or without directly trying to be, like say not borderline or whatever. Focus more on those fundamental neurological, temperamental issues, And I mean, there's no magic, right? Because like say I have cluster B, right? So I'm always going to have a very explosive, a very noise making, whatever, I've chosen to like get away from like say watching pornography or focusing on sexuality. Like I try not to think that much about sexuality, because if I ever do see a picture of like naked people or whatever, it's probably just going to overstimulate me, because that's my brain, And so I have to come up with like, each person has to find their own way, but I have to come up with like say my own like personal, trial and error experiment, whatever, to try to find ways to kind of minimize that part of my experience, because I can't control the fact that I make a lot of noise when I get stimulated, or when I get angry. When things make me angry, it just floods my brain, right? So I have to kind of avoid a lot of conflict, a lot of clashing, and I have to sort of live in a more boring place, because I want to reset my baseline, okay, so that I can, I don't know, like I'm not so dominated by that flooded part of my brain, And I know there's nothing I can do about it, so I have to come up with like say strategies. But I'd like to explore having a different baseline from what I used to have, because I used to just be fireworks, And anyway, it's just, everybody's going to find a different way to deal with it. But I'm just saying that I got to where I'm at, and I'm not saying I'm in a great place, but I got to where I'm at, which is a better place, by focusing more on the temperamental issues and coming up with strategies the best I can. I'm not going to change my temperament, but I can be smart. I can be smart, and I can adopt strategies and experiment with things that improve, I guess, my temperamental baseline, so that I can function better in the world. And yeah, I have to sacrifice certain things, Um, I used to like to have a lot of like say spice in my life, a lot of like gambling, a lot of, attractive things, a lot more bling, a lot more shiny objects. Okay, my life is a lot less shiny than it used to be, but in the end, I think I got more out of it. I'm getting something in exchange for that, So it's like a fair exchange, And in fact, I think my life is a lot better than it used to be. So in a sense, I don't know. It's like each of us has to like say experiment and figure out a strategy. But I think we can develop a better strategy if we don't get overly invested that the cause of our condition is a very simplistic, let's say one dimensional. It may be multidimensional, what actually caused us to be here. And we may want to put not so much focus on the trauma, but also put let's say more focus on the temperamental challenges that we have, and maybe focus on learning to be creative about designing a strategy that's going to help us maybe not get stuck in the places where we have been, so that we can move forward and advance, without pretending that we're changing our temperament. Because at least in my case, my temperament, I don't think I'm going to ever change my temperament, but I can change how I operate in the world with my temperament, so I can at least enjoy a different baseline, have less fireworks, less shiny objects, and therefore at least work on, trying to hold more multiple considerations, and maybe not to be just a slave to being overflooded by stimulation. So we all do what we can, but I think it'll help us if we don't get stuck in a naive understanding of why we're here. Okay, so that's why I'm a skeptic. That's why I'm a trauma skeptic. It doesn't mean trauma doesn't have something to do with where I'm at. It just means that I'm trying to look at the bigger picture and not focus too much on the trauma. So I hope that explains my position, and really appreciate your patience. Thanks for watching.